After 3 years of absolute silence, a blue zone, cordoned off with ropes, emerges among the rocks of Pedra Furada. Within it lies the answer to a disappearance that shattered 2 families and held an entire town in suspense. What the Sea of Jericoacoara had guarded for so long would forever change the fate of Severino and Socorro, the couple from Recife who never returned from their dream honeymoon. The plane flew over Ceará on a December afternoon in 1996. Severino Lemos adjusted his seatbelt and peered through the small window, watching the first dunes appear on the horizon. Beside him, Socorro Andrade flipped through a well-worn tourist guide, its pages marked with blue ink. "Look here, Sevi," she whispered, pointing to a photo of Pedra Furada. "They say it's the most beautiful place in Jericoacoara." He smiled, taking her hand in his. They were both 35. They had been married for just a week, and this was their first time traveling together outside of Pernambuco. Severino repaired televisions and stereos in the Torre neighborhood of Recife. His hands were calloused from a life of wires and circuits, but he was gentle with everything he touched. Socorro taught 7-year-olds at a municipal school in Várzea. She kept every drawing her students gave her in a green folder, as if they were treasures. They had met 2 years earlier at a São João festival in her neighborhood. He was shy. She was effervescent. He was a technician. She was a dreamer. She always had an analog camera hanging from her neck, capturing every important moment. Their wedding was a simple affair at the Rosario Church, complete with an accordion player at the door and sweets made by Socorro's aunt. The honeymoon was the gift they had given themselves after so much planning. Jericoacoara had appeared in a magazine Socorro was reading at a doctor's office. "This is where we're going," she declared, showing him a photo of the endless dunes. Severino had never heard of the place, but one look at her smile was all it took for him to agree. The flight was delayed for an hour in Fortaleza. By the time they caught a bus to Jihoca de Jericoacoara, it was already dark. From there, a jolting open-air truck, a jardinera, carried them over the final kilometers of sand. Socorro slept on his shoulder for most of the ride, while Severino watched the darkness slip by the window. There were no electric lights along the way, only stars that seemed to burn brighter than they ever did in Recife. The scent of the sea air drifted through the gaps in the truck, mingling with the smell of fuel and the sweat of other passengers. They arrived at the Pousada Vento Leste well after 11 o'clock. The owner, a thin Ceará native named Francisco, greeted them in flip-flops and shorts, holding a lantern. "Sorry about the dark, folks. The power here is from a generator and we've already shut it down for the night." He led them to a simple room with a double bed, a ceiling fan, and a window that opened directly to the sea. Socorro drew back the curtain and sighed. Even in the dark, they could hear the rhythmic crash of waves on the sand. "Tomorrow we'll see all of this in the light," Severino said, wrapping his arms around her from behind. They woke to the sound of roosters crowing and the smell of coffee brewing somewhere nearby. Socorro leaped out of bed and ran to the window. The sun was rising behind the dunes, painting the sky in shades of orange and pink. The beach stretched out before the Pousada, empty except for a few fishermen pulling in their nets. She grabbed her camera and snapped the first photo of the trip. Severino, still in bed, stretching his arms with the sea framed perfectly by the open window. Breakfast was served on a wooden table on the Pousada's veranda. Warm tapioca, grilled queijo coalho, sliced fruit, and strong coffee that Socorro found different but delicious. Francisco joined them, explaining how the village worked. "No cars here, just jardineras and horses. To get to Pedra Furada, you have to walk. It's about 2 hours there, 2 hours back." Socorro jotted everything down in a small notebook she'd brought, along with the names of all the places they wanted to see. They spent the morning exploring Jericoacoara's sandy streets. Socorro photographed everything. The simple fishermen's houses, the colorful jangada rafts beached on the shore, the barefoot children running between the dunes. Severino followed her patiently, carrying her bag and stopping whenever she asked him to wait for just one more picture. They bought a straw hat to shield themselves from the sun and sturdier sandals for walking on the sand. In the late afternoon, they climbed the Sunset Dune with other tourists. Socorro leaned on Severino's shoulder as the sky transformed into a canvas of red and gold. "I've never seen anything so beautiful," she whispered, and he knew she wasn't just talking about the view. A couple from Sao Paulo they had met on the way up offered to take a picture of them. Socorro handed over her camera, smoothed out her floral dress, and nestled into Severino's chest. He smiled naturally, a rare thing for someone so shy. They had dinner at a beachside shack, grilled fish, coconut rice, and cashew farofa. Socorro tried everything with curiosity while Severino stuck to what he knew. "You need to be more adventurous," she would say, offering him a forkful of a dish he eyed with suspicion. "I already am," he would reply, gesturing to her. "I married you, didn't I?" They would laugh softly, the way new lovers do when they are discovering the world together. Back in their room, Socorro organized their things for the next day. She wanted to wake up early and walk to Pedra Furada, the postcard image of Jericoacoara. She laid out sunscreen, the camera with 2 new rolls of film, a bottle of water, and the light blue dress she had bought especially for the trip. Severino watched her, admiring the meticulous care she took with things that mattered. "Do you think we can really walk all the way there?" he asked. "Francisco said it's 4 hours round trip." Socorro turned to him, already in her nightgown, her hair loose around her shoulders. "We can do anything when we're together," she replied, moving closer to the bed. "Besides, it'll be our last adventure here. Tomorrow night we'll be on the plane back home." They fell asleep early, lulled by the sound of the waves and the wind against the window. Socorro dreamed of endless dunes and crystal-clear waters. Severino dreamed of the work waiting for him on Monday, but woke up happy to be right there, in that moment with her. It was the first and only honeymoon of their lives, and they wanted it to be unforgettable. The alarm went off at 5:30 in the morning. Socorro sprang from bed with an energy that always amazed Severino, who was a slow riser. "Today is Pedra Furada Day," she announced, already heading for the bathroom. He yawned, stretched, and smiled. In their 2 years together, he had learned that when Socorro made a plan, it was best not to question it, just try to keep up. They had a quick breakfast at the Posada. Francisco was still asleep but had left everything prepared the night before: bread, fruit, a thermos of coffee, and a note wishing them a good trip. Socorro read it aloud. "Be careful with the tide. Come back before 5 in the afternoon." Severino tucked the note into the pocket of his shorts, unaware it would be one of the last written messages ever directed to them. They left the Posada while the sun was still a promise on the horizon. The beach was deserted, marked only by the scurrying tracks of crabs in the wet sand. Socorro carried a bag with their essentials: camera, water, sunscreen, and a snack the owner of the dinner shack had prepared for them. Severino had a simple fanny pack with their money and documents. "Leave the documents in the room," Socorro suggested. "We're just going for a walk. We don't need them." He thought for a moment and agreed. They went back to the room and left their wallets in the nightstand drawer. The walk began peacefully. They followed the shoreline, letting the seawater lap at their bare feet. Socorro stopped every 100 meters or so to take a picture of something: a crab darting into its hole, a peculiar footprint in the sand, Severino walking ahead with the sea behind him. "I'm going to develop all of these when we get home," she said. "I want us to remember every single moment." They passed a few isolated buildings, fishermen's huts where life was already stirring. a beach shack still closed for the morning, a coconut tree Socorro found particularly photogenic. The sun climbed slowly, warming their skin and bringing with it that blissful feeling of vacation, of time stretching out with no rush at all. Severino held her hand as they walked, and every so often she would let go to run toward the water or pick up an interesting shell. 2 hours later, they stopped to rest in the shade of a dune. Socorro pulled the water and the snack from her bag, a ham and cheese sandwich wrapped in aluminum foil. They shared it, eating slowly, savoring the moment. "Look how far we've come," she said, pointing back the way they came. The Posada was no longer visible, just a continuous line of dunes and sea. "And look what's still ahead," she added, pointing to the horizon where the famous rocks of Jericoacoara were beginning to take shape. Severino checked his watch. It was 9:15 a.m. If all went well, they would reach Pedra Furada before noon, have a few hours to enjoy it and take pictures, and head back with plenty of time before dark. It was a simple, safe plan. Socorro tucked the sandwich wrapper back into her bag. She was meticulous about not leaving trash behind, and they resumed their walk. The sea was calm, the sky a cloudless blue. It was one of those perfect days you hold in your memory forever. Pedra Furada appeared on the horizon like a postcard coming to life. Socorro let go of Severino's hand and ran a few meters ahead, pointing at the rock formation. There it is." The natural arch in the rock perfectly framed the blue sea on the other side, creating a window that looked as if it had been carved by the gods. Severino quickened his pace, caught up in her excitement. In the 4 hours they had been walking, he had watched his wife photograph everything, but he knew this moment would be special. They reached the rocks around noon. Other tourists were already there, a group of young people from Fortaleza, a family with 2 children, a foreign couple speaking a language they couldn't identify. Socorro greeted everyone with her natural warmth, asking where they were from and how their walk had been. Severino was more reserved, but he smiled, watching how easily she connected with people. The rocks were larger than they appeared from a distance, smooth stones, shaped by thousands of years of wind and waves, forming a breathtaking landscape. Socorro took her first picture, Pedra Furada, with the sea visible through it like a living painting. Then she asked Severino to pose alone in front of the formation. He felt a little awkward, but he obliged. "Now let's take one together," she said, handing the camera to one of the children from the family. "Do you know how to use this?" The girl, about 10 years old, nodded enthusiastically. They posed hand in hand, Socorro in her light blue dress which fluttered in the sea breeze, and Severino in the beige shorts and white t-shirt he had bought for the trip. The sun was strong, but a constant breeze from the ocean made the heat bearable. The girl took several pictures, carefully composing each shot. "You two are very beautiful together," the child's mother said. Socorro blushed and thanked her, while Severino gave a sheepish smile. They explored the rocks for over an hour. Socorro photographed details, the texture of the stones, the saltwater pools that formed between them. Severino climbing on smaller rocks to get a better view. They ate the rest of their snack in the shade of a large boulder, watching the tide creep in. "The tide is rising," Severino observed. The waves that had been gently lapping at the base of the rocks were now crashing with more force, soaking stones that had previously been dry. The other tourists began to pack up. The family with the children left first, followed by the group from Fortaleza. By 3 in the afternoon, Socorro and Severino were almost alone with only the foreign couple, who were conversing quietly in their incomprehensible tongue. "I think it's time we headed back too," Severino suggested, glancing at the sky. A few clouds were gathering on the horizon, still distant but enough to change the quality of the light. Socorro was too enchanted to leave. "Just a few more pictures," she pleaded. "The light is changing. It's getting more beautiful." She climbed onto a slightly higher rock, trying to find a better angle of the arch. Severino followed, offering a hand to help her up. The rocks were becoming slippery from the sea spray and the increasingly frequent waves washing over their base. It was a spectacle of nature, but one that was beginning to demand more caution. The waves started to pound the rocks with greater intensity. The foreign couple waved to them and started back towards the beach, leaving Socorro and Severino completely alone at Pedra Furada. It was a magical moment, just the two of them, the roar of the sea and the stunning rock formation that had become the backdrop for their honeymoon. Socorro wanted one specific photo, she and Severino sitting on the edge of the main rock, their legs dangling over the sea with the arch of Pedra Furada framing them from behind. "It will be beautiful," she insisted, already looking for the best place to set up the camera. She found a flat stone, a natural tripod where she could balance the camera. She set the timer and ran to position herself beside Severino. The first attempt failed. She couldn't get there in time. On the second, Severino blinked right as the flash went off. They laughed like children, reveling in the private intimacy of a couple in love, far from home. "One more try," Socorro decided. "This one will be perfect." She went back to the camera, adjusted the focus, and triggered the timer once more. Severino waited for her, sitting on the edge of the rock, watching how the sea had changed its mood. The waves were now arriving with more frequency and force, creating larger splashes as they crashed against the stones. The wind had also picked up, carrying a sharper scent of salt and making Socorro's hair fly as she ran to his side. They sat together on the rock's edge, smiled for the camera, and waited for the click. It was in that moment that a wave, larger than the others, surged from behind them. Coming from an angle they hadn't been watching, the water rushed up the rocks with unexpected power, completely soaking their feet and legs, causing Socorro to slip slightly on the smooth stone. Severino's arm shot out instantly. "Careful!" he said, helping her up. They were drenched from the waist down, but they laughed at the situation. "Does nature want to be in the picture too?" Socorro joked, walking back to get the camera and see if the shot had turned out. The photo was perfect. The two of them smiling, holding hands with the blue sea behind them and that very wave cresting at the exact moment of the flash. "Now we can go," Severino said, looking at the sea, which remained restless. More large waves were arriving at irregular intervals, some smaller, others capable of drenching rocks that had been completely dry just minutes before. Socorro agreed, carefully placing the camera in her bag after the soaking. They started to climb down from the rocks toward the stretch of sand. It was then that Socorro remembered she had forgotten to photograph a specific detail. A smaller formation next to the main arched rock that had caught her eye earlier. "Just one more minute," she pleaded. "I promise it'll be quick." Severino sighed, but then he smiled. He knew that determination when it came to her photography. "I'll go with you," he said, but watch out for these waves." They headed back toward the larger rocks, this time paying close attention to the sea's behavior. The waves came in sets, 3 or 4 smaller ones, followed by 1 or 2 much larger ones. There seemed to be a logic to it, a pattern they could predict to move safely between the surges. The rock formation Socorro wanted to photograph was in a position closer to the open sea. To get there, they would have to climb over rocks that were being regularly washed over by the bigger waves. Severino studied the situation. There was a possible path, jumping from stone to stone, but they would need to time their movements perfectly between waves. "Let's go slowly," he said, taking her hand. "When I say now, we jump to the next one." Socorro nodded, trusting his prudence. They had hiked many trails together in Pernambuco. They knew each other's limits. They observed the pattern of the waves for a few minutes. 3 small, 1 medium, 2 large, and then a pause of about a minute. They managed to reach the spot Socorro wanted. From there, the angle of the arched rock was different, more dramatic, with the whole framing not just the sea but other smaller formations as well. She took several photos quickly, taking advantage of the light that was beginning to turn golden with the late afternoon. "Done. Now let's go," Severino said when he saw a series of larger waves forming in the distance. But as they turned to go back, they realized the tide had risen more than they had imagined. Some of the stones they had used to get there were now completely submerged. The way back would not be the same. They looked for an alternative route. There were other rocks they could use as a passage, but they would require bigger leaps this time. "We can do it," she said, looking at Severino, zipping her camera bag tightly. "It's just a matter of timing." They began the return, jumping from rock to rock as the waves receded. Severino went first, testing each foothold before taking the next step, extending a hand to help Socorro. She followed him with confidence, that same determination that made her face any challenge when they had a common goal. They were halfway back when a different kind of wave arrived. Bigger, faster, coming from a lateral angle they hadn't noticed before. The water surged over the rocks with astonishing force, rising to their knees. Socorro slipped on the wet stone, lost her balance, and pulled Severino with her as she tried to grab onto him. They fell together into the water, not very deep at that point, but enough to leave them completely soaked. Socorro's bag flew open and a few items began to float away. Sunscreen, a scarf, some coins. Severino got up first and helped her to her feet, but another wave was already coming, this one even bigger. "Run for that rock!" he yelled, pointing to a higher formation farther from the water. They tried to run, but the water around their ankles made movement difficult. The next wave caught them while they were still in the water, stronger than the last, making them lose their balance again. It was then they realized this was not just a normal change in the tide. It was a surge, a riptide, arriving with brutal speed, with waves in a sequence that would not allow them to easily escape their position. The sea, which minutes before had seemed controllable and predictable, now showed a face they had never seen. Socorro looked at Severino, and for the first time on their trip, there was fear in her eyes. The sequence of waves did not stop. Every time they tried to stand and get out of the water, another wave would arrive, stronger than the one before. Socorro's bag was gone, completely carried away by the current along with the camera, the documents they had decided not to bring, and all their other belongings. Now it was just the two of them, drenched, trying to find a safe path back to the beach. Severino managed to reach a higher rock and extended his hand to Socorro. She tried to climb, but the rock was slippery and her wet sandals offered no grip. "Take off your sandals!" he shouted over the roar of the waves. "Barefoot is safer!" She obeyed, but as she bent down to remove the second sandal, another wave hit her from behind. The force of the water slammed her against the rocks. Severino leaped from his perch to help her, but was hit by the same wave. They were dragged together for several feet, scraping against smaller stones, trying to grab onto anything solid. Salt water stung their eyes and filled their mouths, making it hard to breathe and see. When they managed to find their footing again, they were in an even more precarious position. The surrounding rocks were smaller, less stable, and the water was already up to their waists. Socorro had a cut on her right arm from the impact. Severino tasted blood in his mouth, but didn't know if it was his own or just the salt mixing with a cut on his lip. "We need to swim for the beach," Socorro said, trying to stay calm. She knew how to swim, having learned as a child. Severino also knew the basics, but had never swum in the ocean, much less in conditions like these. "It's too far," he replied, gauging the distance to the dry sand. "And with these waves..." They tried anyway. They started swimming toward the shore, but the waves pushed them back toward the rocks. It was like fighting a force immensely greater than themselves, one that pulled and pushed them without their control. With each attempt, they grew more tired, more desperate, and farther from safety. It was then that something unexpected appeared on the horizon. A blue tarp, the kind used on construction sites, was floating on the water. It was tied with ropes and bobbed like a makeshift raft. Perhaps it had broken loose from a boat or fallen from a truck on the coastal road. To them, in that moment, it looked like a plank of salvation. Severino managed to grab one of the tarp's ropes. The material was tough, waterproof, and offered a buoyancy they lacked on their own. "Hold on here," he said to Socorro, who grabbed the rope on the other side. The tarp was large enough for both of them to hold on to, and for a moment they felt a wave of relief. They had found something to keep them afloat, but the waves kept coming. And now, instead of fighting against them, they were being carried along with the tarp in a direction they could not control. The sea was now in command, deciding where they would go, how long they would stay, and what the fate of this once joyful afternoon would be. Severino tried to shout for help, but his voice was lost in the roar of the waves and the howling wind. He looked toward the beach, which now seemed more distant than ever. There was no one visible on the sand, no boats on the horizon, no possibility of rescue they could see. The next few hours blurred into a confused sequence of salt water, slippery ropes, and the constant deafening sound of the waves. They took turns holding onto the blue tarp, which had become the only solid thing in a liquid world that would not stop moving. The sun began to set, painting the sky in shades of orange, but the beauty of the landscape was now only a reminder that night was approaching. Socorro felt the muscles in her arms burn from clinging to the ropes. Her hands, accustomed only to holding chalk and erasers, were not made for this kind of strain. Severino tried to keep her calm, speaking softly whenever the waves allowed, reminding her of good times they had shared. "Remember the first time I took you to meet my mother?" he said. "You were so nervous you spilled your juice on the table." The tarp kept them afloat, but it also carried them farther from the coast. Each passing wave pushed them toward the open sea, where the water grew deeper and their chances of reaching any solid ground diminished. They had lost all control. All that was left was to endure and hope that someone would find them, or that they would drift to some safe harbor. When night fell completely, it brought a cold they hadn't felt during the day. The sea, which had been refreshing, now chilled their wet skin to the bone. Socorro began to tremble, not just from the cold, but from exhaustion and extreme pain. Her strength was reaching its limit. "I can't anymore," she whispered to Severino. "My arms, they can't hold on." He pulled her closer to him on the tarp. "Hold on to me," he said. "We'll share the weight." She leaned against him and he wrapped an arm under hers, trying to better distribute the effort of clinging to the rope. It was an uncomfortable position for him, but it allowed her to rest her muscles for a few moments. The stars appeared in the clear sky, the same stars they had seen on their first night in Jericoacoara, when everything was anticipation and happiness. Now they were silent witnesses to a struggle that seemed impossible to win. Socorro looked up, trying to find a constellation she knew, a reference point to calm her. "The Three Marys," she said, pointing to the stars that formed Orion's belt. "My grandmother used to say they guide the lost." The sea remained rough, but in a different way than in the afternoon. The waves were now longer, deeper, lifting the tarp and its passengers high into the air before letting them descend gently. It was a hypnotic rhythm that made them feel as if they were being rocked by a gigantic, indifferent force. Severino felt his own strength beginning to fail. His hands, accustomed to handling delicate wires and small electronic components, ached from gripping the thick ropes, but he could not show weakness. Socorro depended on him to keep fighting. "We're going to get out of this," he repeated, more to convince himself than her. "Someone will find us." But deep down they were beginning to understand that no one was looking for them. At the inn, the owner probably assumed they had decided to spend the night on the beach. Back home, their families weren't expecting to hear from them until their scheduled return. They were utterly alone in that dark immensity of water, depending only on each other and a blue tarp that had appeared like a miracle but was now also their prison. Socorro closed her eyes and tried to imagine she was at home, in her warm bed, listening to the rain on the tin roof of the house where she grew up. It was a mental exercise she had used since childhood whenever she was scared or felt lost. But this time, the sound of the water was not comforting. It was too real, too present, too inescapable. The early morning brought an exhaustion they had never known. They took turns in periods of semi-consciousness, one watching while the other rested against the tarp. Their voices were hoarse from swallowing salt water, and thirst was becoming as tormenting as the physical fatigue. The irony of being surrounded by water and unable to drink was not lost on them. When the sun rose again, it brought with it a renewed hope. Socorro managed to rally, pointing to the coast, still visible as a distant line on the horizon. "Look," she said, her voice a rasp. "You can still see land. We're not that far." Severino forced a smile, but he knew the distance was a cruel illusion. At sea, visual references fail. Unlike on solid ground, there is nothing to fix your gaze upon. All morning they tried to paddle with their hands, using the tarp as a makeshift raft, straining toward the coast. The work was slow, a study in frustration. For every yard they gained toward the beach, the ocean currents dragged them 2 yards sideways or back out to sea. The ocean, it seemed, had a will of its own, and it never chose the path they desired. Around midday, Socorro began to show signs of severe dehydration. Her tongue was swollen, her words thick and difficult to form. Severino was not much better, but he fought to remain lucid, to make decisions for them both. "Let's try drinking a little seawater," he suggested, his own voice a dry rasp. "Just a sip, to wet our mouths." It was a desperate measure, but their thirst had become an unbearable torment. They drank small gulps of the salt water, knowing the danger but seeing no other choice. The liquid burned their already raw throats, offering only a moment's relief. Soon they were thirstier than before. The salt was leaching the water from their bodies at an accelerated pace. The afternoon of the second day was the most difficult. Socorro drifted into episodes of delirium, speaking to people who were not there, conversing with her students as if she were in a classroom. "Children, take out your colored pencils," she would say, her hands moving as if distributing school supplies. "We're going to draw the sea." Severino would try to pull her back to reality, but sometimes it was kinder to let her exist in that imaginary world where she was still a teacher and safe. He himself began to struggle to distinguish reality from the phantoms conjured by exhaustion and dehydration. Now and then, he thought he saw boats on the horizon or heard voices calling their names. But when he tried to find the source of the sounds or visions, there was only more sea, more waves, more solitude. The blue tarp, which had been their salvation, now showed signs of wear. One of the ropes was fraying, a result of the constant chafe of their hands and the relentless force of the waves. If the tarp came apart completely, they would have nothing left to cling to. It was a race against a time they could not win. As the second sunset bled across the sky, Severino looked at Socorro. She was sleeping against him, her head on his shoulder. He saw that she was paler, her breathing shallow. Her strength was fading faster than his. "Hold on a little longer," he whispered in her ear. "We're going to make it." The second night was colder than the first. Socorro shivered uncontrollably in Severino's arms as he tried to warm her with his own body. She murmured disconnected words, mixing childhood memories with fragments of their trip. "Mama, the water is too cold," she said. "I don't want to get in the pool today." Severino held her tighter, knowing he was losing her to the delirium. He felt his own consciousness slipping into strange places. For a moment, he thought they were in his workshop back in Recife, fixing an old radio. "Pass me the soldering iron, Socorro," he asked. "I need to replace this capacitor." But when he reached out his hand, he found only the wet rope of the blue tarp, which remained their only anchor between them and the black abyss of the sea. In the early hours of the morning, Socorro's breathing became more irregular. She coughed up salt water and spasms racked her body. Severino realized she was going into shock, the result of hypothermia and severe dehydration. "Stay with me," he repeated, rocking her gently. "Don't leave me alone out here." When the morning of the third day arrived, Socorro did not respond to Severino's calls. Her eyes were closed, her breath nearly imperceptible. He held her face in his hands, trying to wake her, but she had slipped into an unconsciousness from which she would not return. Her body was still warm, but Severino knew he was losing the battle. He spent the next few hours holding Socorro against his chest, talking to her as if she could still hear him. He told her stories of when they were dating, of the plans they had made for the future, of the house they wanted to buy in the countryside when he saved enough money. "You would plant your flowers in the yard," he said, "and I would build a workshop in the back, far from the kitchen so I wouldn't bother you." The tarp continued to drift at the mercy of the currents, carrying them both far from any possibility of rescue. Severino stared at the empty horizon with no strength left to paddle or try to change their course. His hands could no longer grip the ropes firmly. Thirst had become a constant, dominating pain that consumed his every thought. Late in the afternoon of the third day, Socorro stopped breathing. Severino felt the exact moment she left, a sudden slackening of her muscles, a stillness that stood in stark contrast to the days of struggle they had shared. He continued to hold her, refusing to accept that he was now alone in that blue immensity. "I won't leave you here," he whispered to her. "We came together. We'll stay together." He used a piece of the rope from the tarp to tie her body to his own, ensuring they would not be separated even if his strength failed completely. It was a desperate act of love, a promise he made to her and to himself. Night fell again, bringing with it stars he could no longer see clearly. Severino felt his own life ebbing away, without Socorro to talk to, without her voice to keep him awake. His consciousness began to slip into a dark, silent place. "Wait for me," he murmured to her. "I'm coming." 3 years passed like a silent eternity over the waters of Jericoacoara. When the Vento Leste Inn changed hands, Francisco sold the business and moved to Fortaleza after the case gained national attention. The families of Severino and Socorro held memorial services, had them declared legally dead, and tried to move on with their lives. But the sea kept secrets it was not yet ready to reveal. In early 1999, a violent storm surge struck the entire Ceará coast. Winds of over 60 kilometers per hour and 5-meter waves reshaped the coastline, dragging boats ashore and revealing wreckage that had been hidden for decades on the ocean floor. It was the kind of tempest the old fishermen said came only once in a generation. Raimundo Silva awoke before dawn on the morning of August 15th. A fisherman for 30 years, he knew the Jericoacoara Sea like few others. He could read the signs nature gave before great changes. That morning, the ocean had a different color, an agitation that was not normal, even after an intense storm. Something strange will wash up on the beach today, he told his wife before leaving the house. He walked along the wet sand toward the Pedra Furada rock formation, where he usually checked his nets after a storm. The sky was still dark, but the horizon was beginning to lighten with the first signs of sunrise. It was a moment of peace he always cherished, alone on the beach with only the sound of the waves for company. That's when he saw it, a blue mass wedged between the rocks. From a distance, it looked like just another piece of debris brought in by the storm. Pieces of boats, truck tarps, remnants of construction that the sea sometimes returned to the land. But there was something about the shape of this object that caught his attention. There were two distinct forms molded as if they held something seared inside. He approached slowly with the caution of a man who had seen many strange things appear on the beach after a storm. The blue tarp was partially torn, faded by years of sun and salt, but still strong enough to have kept its original shape. The ropes that bound it were worn, yet firm. He did not open it. Instinctively, he knew this was not something to be disturbed alone. He ran back home, woke his wife, and asked her to call the police. "There's something strange at Pedra Furada," he said. "I think you need to see this." In less than an hour, the beach that had been the scene of Severino and Socorro's disappearance 3 years earlier was once again bustling with police, forensic experts, and onlookers. The tarp was removed with extreme care. When it was opened, it revealed two complete human skeletons still clad in deteriorated clothing that allowed for immediate identification. A tattered light blue dress, faded beige shorts, and a golden wedding band with the initials S and S still visible after years submerged in salt water. The forensic report was conclusive, bringing the closure the families had awaited for 3 years. Severino Lemos and Socorro Andrade died of drowning, likely on the same day they disappeared from Pedra Furada. Analysis of the bones and belongings confirmed they were surprised by a sudden change in sea conditions, a common occurrence in that region at certain times of the year. The blue tarp that enveloped them was not part of any plan or crime. It was simply a piece of construction material that had been adrift at sea, possibly lost from a boat or truck. The ocean currents and the motion of the waves had caused it to wrap around their bodies while still in the water, creating a natural shroud that preserved them for years in a submerged crevice among the rocks. The family received the bodies for burial in Recife. The funeral was simple, held in the same church where they had been married 3 years before. Socorro's students, now older, brought drawings and flowers to say goodbye to the teacher they remembered with affection. Severino's work colleagues came as a group carrying a wreath with the inscription, "To the friend who could fix everything except a broken heart." The Vento Lesti Inn was demolished 2 years later. In its place, they built a small square with a simple memorial, 2 bronze plaques with the names of Severino and Socorro and the phrase, "In memory of those who chose this place to live moments of happiness." There was no needless drama, only the silent acknowledgement of 2 lives that had crossed paths with fate in those waters. Pedra Furada remains one of Jericoacoara's most popular tourist spots. Thousands of couples pose for photos in the same place where Severino and Socorro took their last pictures together. The sea continues to change its mood without warning. The waves continue to arrive with unpredictable force. But now there are signs, warning of the dangers of the tides and of getting too close to the rocks. Raimundo Silva could never again fish in the Pedra Furada area without remembering that August morning. He moved his fishing spots to other quieter parts of the coast, where the sea seemed less burdened with stories. "Some things," he used to say when asked about the case, "are best left where they lie." And if you've made it to the end of this story, please subscribe to the channel and share it with others who also enjoy learning about the real cases that have marked this country's history. We have many more stories waiting for you.